My name is Olivier Krischer. I am the convener, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the last of our talks for the Sydney Asian Art Series in 2022. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Gadigal and Wangal people on whose lands I live and work, and where I'm speaking from today here in Gadigal country. I extend my acknowledgements and respect to all First Nations people joining today. I'd also like to thank Anne for her comments, but also our partners at VisAsia who've been so supportive since the series began in 2017, and the Art Gallery of New South Wales. It's been very much a collaborative venture that has seen the series bring 4 international scholars to present on timely issues in Asian art research around a central theme each year. Focusing on diverse approaches to photographic research has been our theme this year, and the title of the series has been Troubling Images. This phrase was intentionally chosen to recognize both the continued capacity for images to trouble our expectations, or to unsettle, for example, our assumptions about issues such as identity, justice, belonging, memory, history, and of course, the very nature of what we term reality or realism. But troubling images also is supposed to invoke the way that the research of our 4 invited scholars has the capacity also to unsettle and to challenge existing approaches to photographic understanding itself, particularly in and from Asia. It's a comment on the pervasive and slippery nature of photography itself, that both as image object and as action, that our 4 invited speakers hail from quite distinct intellectual backgrounds, and their work ranges from the 19th century to the present, from China to Japan, Vietnam, South Asia, in a range of different media contexts. In April, art historian Roberta Wu began the series introducing new research on John Thompson and the Chinese export image, revealing ways in which Thompson's foreign gaze was in fact very much in dialogue and sometimes competition with existing local painting culture and its export economy. In May, Professor of Media Studies and co-editor of Trans-Asia Photography Journal, Professor Thi Hu, presented Warring Visions, Vietnam Pictorial and the Colors of Socialist Futurity, proposing socialist ways of seeing in Vietnam, but also of Vietnam from abroad through close reading of the illustrated magazine Vietnam Pictorial. And just last month, Professor Chris Pinney, anthropologist of South Asia and visual culture of South Asia, shared recent work which puts Euro-American critical and photographic theory into dialogue with his ongoing fieldwork in India, Nepal, and Bangladesh as part of the collaborative Photo Demos project, in which he emphasizes the aspirational nature of the medium, not only what has been as a document or record, but rather what might be. So today I am delighted to round off these very rich series to welcome Professor Miryam Sas, who is Professor of Comparative Literature and Film and Media at the University of California, Berkeley. For visual culture and art historians such as myself, she may be best known for her close reading of post-war Japanese theatre, film, intermedia, dance, animation in her 2010 book, Experimental Arts in Post-War Japan, Moments of Encounter, Engagement, and Imagined Return. Her new book, which has just come out this past week, congratulations, on which her talk is also based today, extends her work on media theory and intermediate art in Japan, suggestively titled Feeling Media, Potentiality, and the Afterlife of Art. This has just been released from Duke University Press, and I know that she has a slide prepared for those of you who are curious. Her talk today, Realism and Media, Reconsidering Japanese Women Photographers, really builds on the work on women photographers from Feeling Media, her new book, focusing particularly on the photographer Tokiwa Toyoko, who photographed the red light districts, or so-called akasen chitai, of Yokohama in the 1950s and 60s. I'd like to start by posing a couple of questions to Professor Sas about her research background and previous publications. There is, of course, a full standard biography for Professor Sas on the Power Publications website. So I suggest if you're interested in other sorts of publication background, have a look there as well. So welcome, Professor Sas.
Thank you.
Very nice to be able to have you here online. And we do, of course, wish you could join us perhaps in the future here in Sydney.
I hope so.
I know that your foundation is in comparative literature, yet your work is focused on the interplay of Japanese art practice and theory, often in dialogue with, of course, international or particularly European ideas around critical theory and artistic practice. Your first monograph, Fault Lines, Cultural Memory and Japanese Surrealism, which was published in 2001, looked at artistic experimentation in 20th century Japan and France, issues of poetics and literary theory, and particularly the legacies of surrealism, Japanese modernism. So I'd like to ask what led you to this kind of comparative focus in your earlier work, both in terms of the geographic or cultural sort of epistemological between Japan and France, but also text, image, and I would say action. I find these sorts of intersections seem such a rich part of your ongoing work, including your new book. What led you to this kind of comparative approach?
So that's a good question. And I guess it's a bit different in my first book and in my second book. The first book is really focused on poetry and poetics. And image comes in there because the surrealist poets like Kitazo no Katsue became very interested in making poems out of objects, plastic poems, and Takiguchi Shuzo, who was known as one of the early surrealists, also became very well known as a leader in the artistic movements in the post-war, such as Chikken Kobo, experimental workshop. And he kind of shows up everywhere in everything. So I started with his poetry and poetics and relationship with surrealism, but wound up kind of following those artists out into their post-war work, probably to be really truthful. My own interest started with the post-war work, and I was interested in Butoh when I spent my first year in Japan, dancing in Ono Kazuo's workshop and translating for that workshop, just sort of improvisationally as he spoke. So I was very interested in the imbrication of language and corporeality that takes place in Butoh, and that comes up kind of in the epilogue of my first book. And then that kind of grew into the second project, which focuses more on the 60s and 70s, more on theater, more on underground theater, somewhat dance. But the artists, it seemed, both the artists and the critics who I worked on didn't really respect the disciplinary boundaries that we have here in academia. You know, they didn't think, oh, well, I'm going to be studied in a literature program, so let me stick with text. They really mixed it up in terms of their own artistic practices. They also mixed up artistic practice and theoretical writing. They and then, you know, they all just kind of hung out together. So I wound up sort of sliding outwards into other realms. Terayama Shuji, who figures a lot in my second book, was working in film as well as video letters, poetry, and theater. So Betsuyaku Minoru is largely in the theater realm, but I think he's very interesting textually. And there's a lot of connections, but I think it's my own sort of following the wave of those artists and following the wave of those avant-gardes and experiments, which maybe are taking place also in the visual arts in the pre-war period, but where I'm focusing on the literary arts, and then how some of those same avant-garde explorations find their way into different media in the post-war, into inquiries about corporeality, about bodies that'll come up today. And then through all the wonderful kind of arts institutions getting involved into more contemporary arts as well.
Yeah, no, that traces actually a lot of the contours of my second question for you. Before I hand
Okay.
over, because as you say, not really respecting these disciplinary boundaries. I think your work has done a great job of trying to navigate those sorts of border crossings. And in your second book, as you alluded to, it furthers this interest, particularly in Japanese art practice across a range of media. I mentioned some film, photography, theater, intermedia of the 1960s in particular, and especially the sorts of theoretical ideas that were happening between practice and, of course, the writing around what was happening. Ideas of eizo, for example, or the so-called, often considered the mechanical image, which was already in dialogue with things that were happening, in Walter Benjamin and so on, that sort of knowledge in Japan, but also engaged very much with the political moment of the 60s and the idea of political engagement itself. So my second question is your three projects of these three sort of monographs, including your most recent, seem quite intimately related, and the way you've just described them, I think already traces out some of these threads, moving across the modern period into the contemporary, as you've also just sort of mentioned, which is the subject of one of the chapters of your new book, I believe. And so I'd like to ask about the threads from your second book, Experimental Arts in Post-War, which led you to explore particularly feeling, so the idea of feeling media and the effective sort of quality of media in your new book. What are those sorts of connections for you?
Well, I would say, I would say in the last book, I had no idea that I would ever be talking about feeling or affect in any way. But what I knew was that I was fascinated by photographers and theorists like Nakahira Takuma, who were working with political engagement, but also kind of visual, critical ideas around how the subject is tries to dominate and understand the world, but like say the photographer, ideas of art where the photographer is a me who's making a statement, who's doing something. And what they were interested in was to get around or outside of or beside that and let the technology of the camera capture something that's actually beyond the capacity of the subject to grasp, to kind of document or fragment or cut out pieces of reality, to kind of quote the Provoke Manifesto. And that interest in how a subject relates to larger structures that are actually beyond their capacity to grasp is deeply explored in affect theory in really, really interesting ways. And so that's kind of brought me out into that direction, I think. And so there's a lot more about Provoke. There's a lot more about photographic theory in my next book, as well as then moving into media theory and media studies. And also animation comes up there as well. So that might be the sort of hook, I think. It's trying to understand how can photography do something, or how did photographers try to work with this critical sense that language is not able to grasp, or language has come to a kind of dead end, and photography can offer something that language needs to push thought forward. So that kind of complex imbrication between language and the photographic, for me, links to many of the kinds of issues around feeling and affect and infrastructure also as a key term that have been discussed in more recent years.
Thank you. That's such an insight into, I think, what we'll hear a little bit about. And you've also mentioned your next book, which I know that some of what you're working on today is a preview of that, which I feel so happy to be able to share here. Thank you. Before I hand over, a quick note about sort of protocols around the webinar format. Most of you listening will be familiar, but there will be a Q&A function. So on the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to find a little Q&A icon. And you can post questions there, please, rather than in the chat. And I'll sort of mediate those at the end of Professor Sas's talk, which will go for around 40 minutes. And then we'll have a good 15 minutes or so for some questions and discussion, which I'll be moderating. So thank you all. And I'll, with that, hand over to you, Professor Sas, to bring up your slides and make sure they're looking the way you want them to look.
Hello, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm so excited to be working with you on this and to be here. And I want to thank the University of Sydney, the Power Institute, as well as the Australian Institute of Asian Culture and Visual Arts, Viz Asia, of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and Olivier Krischer for inviting me here to speak on this very special occasion. I'm honored to be selected as a Sydney Asian Art Scholar this year and to participate in this series. Today, we are celebrating the release of my latest book, Feeling Media, Potentiality and the Afterlife of Art from Duke University Press from 2022. I have it right here as well. And excited to have a physical copy. So I'm taking advantage of the occasion by sharing some new work that has emerged from the thinking of that book and may form the seed of my next project. And that new work is going to be done in collaboration, likely with Maiko Morimoto of Aoyama Gakuin University. So Feeling Media is a book in 2 parts with 6 chapters on intermedia art, experimental animation, theories of the culture industry, photography, and contemporary visual art in 2 chapters across. So the sort of second half is the more contemporary part. The first part of the book explores emergent movements in media and intermedia arts in the 1960s and 70s. And the second half examines the legacies of those theoretical and artistic trends in the work of more recent artists since the 2000s, and in particular after the triple disaster of Tohoku Fukushima. In the book, I offer a framework of analysis that I call the affective scale, the space where artists and theorists work between the level of the individual and larger global and historical shifts, between the personal and systemic structures. Through looking at photography and in the process of doing the research for this book, I discovered many exciting recent artists whose work emerges on multiple levels in grappling at the affective scale with those relays between larger infrastructures and the subjects who constitute and are constituted by them. So Ishiuchi Miyako is one of the photographers I deal with in the book, and she forms a kind of a bridge between the 2 eras that I speak about in the book. Her career begins in the 70s and continues until more recent times. And this is an example from the Apartment series in which she photographs the textures and seams and physical elements of Yokosuka and Yokohama, which is something that we'll see that will kind of create a bridge in a way into the talking about Tokiwa Toyoko that I'll do today. In the book, I also discuss Kazama Sachiko's Non-Human Crossing and her woodblock print works. You can see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but like the Twitter birds, and this is a kind of a satirical or kind of dark image of the history of censorship and through some very contemporary new media practices as well, and surveillance. I write about Kobayashi Fumiko, whose 1,000 Feet and the Fruit of Beginning is on the cover as well. She walked around her neighborhood and around Roppongi collecting discarded clothing and chairs, and built it into this large infrastructural wall inside of the Mori Art Museum. I also write about the photographer Asaka Yoko. This is a slide from her Bambi Berlin from 2006. She did a series here going around the world showing intimate spaces in which families are consuming or watching Hollywood blockbusters. This example is Bambi Berlin. And she also did the series Passage, in which she drove around Aomori in the north of Japan and photographed these places in the landscape where there are these electronic signs telling the direction of the wind. So she went around searching for and chasing the wind. And that's very resonant in the years after the triple disaster, when wind can carry radiation and other invisible questions of invisibility come up through her work. So I find it very interesting and exciting, and I write about it in the book. So many of the photographers I've studied from the 60s and 70s define themselves in a lineage that departs strongly and sharply from a previous generation of photographers that called themselves realist. So when I wrote about provoke photography, I watched the term real, or terms like showing the world as it is, come up over and over again, also in monoha, the visual art sculpture movement, but always the real had different meanings. And I wondered how my explorations of the affective scale could be extended and rethought in relation to problems of the real, of realisms, and most specifically in terms of questions of media and gender. The poster photo for today's talk, this is also another moment of Nakahira Takuma, another photographer who I talk about in the book in his Circulations, Date, Place, Events exhibition from 1971. These, all of whom are talking about different elements of actuality, of the moment, of the real. So in today's talk, which is still warm off the press, this poster photo is a picture by the realist photographer Tokiwa Toyoko, whose career began in the 1950s era when realist photography had its heyday. So it's precisely that realist era against which most of the photographers I've written about up to now were pushing. They all reject that realist era and try to do something else. Tokiwa is known in part for being the only woman photographer included in the famous Eyes of 10 exhibitions that eventually led to the formation of the Vivo agency with Tomatsu Shomei, Kawada Kikuchi, Hosoe Eiko, and Narahara Iko, all of whom are extremely famous photographers. Although she herself, though she was one of the Eyes of 10, was not included in the Vivo collective that formed out of those exhibitions. I got to know about Tokiwa's work through the Bombas Gent Centre d'Art exhibition in Valencia, Spain, The Gaze of Things, Japanese Photography in the Context of Provoke. And I wrote in that catalog. There, it may be legendary or a bit apocryphal, but it was very clear in the formation of that exhibition that Tokiwa's works were relatively very rarely considered at the time, at least as part of what is now the global boom of interest in Provoke and post-war Japanese photography. That Tokiwa's work was mainly considered rather as historical documents than works of an individual photographer worthy of note. In the end, the Yokohama Historical Museum was the source for the work, which was then printed in Spain by a well-known Spanish photographer who is active in Valencia. So you couldn't even really get prints of her work. And the curator said, of that exhibition said when she talked to the family, they seemed very surprised that Tokiwa would be included in an art exhibition like that one. So in short, there's a lot of challenges around certain women photographers being thought of mainly as historical, their work being considered mainly as historical document rather than as sort of work worthy of consideration in itself. And also the problem of amateur photography being seen as amateur or being seen as journalistic rather than as the work of someone who we would need to study. In the end, we'll see that Tokiwa's oeuvre ultimately poses a challenge to several categories. First of all, it asks us to rethink essentialist perspectives on what it means to be a woman, a problem that we can continue to talk about, and then to reconsider the relation between the terms woman and photography or the user of a particular technological and optical medium, and how that changes what woman comes to mean. And third, it poses a challenge to realisms or ideas of the real. In order to arrive at that point of challenge, however, it makes sense to take a moment to traverse the range of definitions of realism that were current during her career, beginning with the work of Domon Ken. Domon Ken was known as an instigator of the movement of realist photography in early 1950s Japan. As many have discussed, his own series of photographs, as well as the amateur photography contest, which he judged in the magazine Camera, instigated a wave of amateur photography and mobilized an idea of realism that hinged on the term snap, sunapu. And this is a picture of Chikuho no Kodomotachi, one of his famous works from a little bit later. His famous phrase, the absolute snapshot, absolutely unstaged, zettai hienshitsu no zettai sunapu, became an important keyword for the wave or movement of realist photography, or as he otherwise puts it, photographic realism take as their fundamental method snap photography with a prerequisite or premise of being absolutely unstaged. When we think about what the idea of staged or unstaged actually means, it's worth taking a moment on this term enshitsu. It can mean production, representation, dramatic presentation, performance, dramaturgy. To do enshitsu is to produce or stage or represent, and enshitsuka is the director of a play. Thus, the idea of hi-enshitsu would be the opposite of performative staging or direction, the non, the the anti of staging. When we unpack the idea of absolutely unstaged, then, we need to think about the impossible metaphysics of unmediatedness that it implies or imposes, in which if you take away all performance, you reach something like naturalness or truth or the real. As if in daily life, gender, social position in the public sphere did not itself involve a certain degree of performativity, even in its ritual repetitions. Anyone who has a kid knows that children, who are the classic locus of the unstaged in Domon's realism movement, perform quite a bit and complicate the place of imagined innocence and absoluteness of this idea of the unstaged. What in fact happened in the 1950s as a result of this work is that the realism he and his colleague Kimura Ihei had encouraged eventually was seen to devolve into a mere style or mannerism. Realism was said to exist if you focused on a particular subject matter. So they received piles of submissions of photos, one after the other, of beggars, the poor in the streets, and dirty things that were not socially supposed to be pictured. Kimura went so far, half ironically, as to call it kuso realism, poop photography, because in the contests, he received so many photos of diapers on the line, night soil buckets in the back alleys. And this is an example of that kind of beggar photography. I think it's a very, very striking one that's interestingly discussed in Julia Adnais Thomas's very interesting and useful introduction to post-war realist photography. Domon himself also deprecated beggar photography and declared that the era of realism had come to an end in 1954. And Thomas talks interestingly about how this can be read formally as a work of art or else as a work of kind of realist document. There's nothing left to take. One can't go on like this, Domon said in 1954. Kai Yoshiaki points out in his study of the history of the term snap that the term was associated with candid photography, in which in most cases the subjects were not aware of the camera. Here seems that they are, though. This is from Chikuho no Kodomotachi, a very striking, famous, very, very famous image. So in general, the style of sunapu involves a handheld camera, such as a twin lens reflex camera, which is what Tokiwa used, and taking the photo without being noticed by the subject or subjects. The ethical issue of taking photos without the act of photography being noticed, at least not until they saw the flash, is worthy of further thought, which we will get to in a moment. But for now, let's just establish that that was at times inherent in the understanding of snap style. Today, what I want to think about is the way in which gender complicates the unstaged snap, the supposedly anti-performative act or praxis of picture taking that aims at capturing something unmediated, often as a way to unveil political and social realities. There's, in fact, of course, a rather intense performativity, a staging, and even a costuming that prepares the way for the sneaked snapshot. Tokiwa hides her camera inside a furoshiki, or a wrapping cloth, or under a coat or cloak. And there's this excitement in catching the moment, the sneaking up, the gun metaphors that appear so often in Tokiwa's writing about her shooting. Enshitsu, or staging, is already there very much in the process of taking these photographs. Tokiwa plays up such a dramaturgy in her autobiographical account of shooting in the red light district. In Kiken no Arabana, Dangerous Fruitless Flowers, or Dangerous Poisonous Flowers, a book she published in October 1927, that's a Speak-O, 1957, after having participated in the Eyes of 10 exhibition, Tokiwa talks about taking photos from the second floor of an okonomiyaki stand. This is in the red light district, or the red line district, that was about to be closed down due to, or shifted at least due to the anti-prostitution laws. She took photos at a health clinic where she hid the camera under a white lab coat. What we might even say is that this ethically problematic modality, typical of snapshot realism, makes Tokiwa a cameraman, as she was often called. You could almost say that the act of the snap puts her in a masculinist stance, although cameraman is supposed to be a gender-neutral term. It puts her in a kind of masculinist stance in relation to the women she photographs. She becomes the subject of the technological gaze to their object. And in her writings, she emphasizes this by talking about her camera as a weapon, as a gun, the need to shoot, the need to hunt, as if the women were prey. She emphasizes this aggressive rhetoric and also the distance from her subjects that this stance demonstrated and also required of her. She also then narrates for us the troubling of this distance and stance and the complex ways in which the idea of woman migrates from one person to another, rather uncertainly, in her acts of photographing, in complex imbrication with class, because she's from an upper middle class family. Her home was burned in the fire bombings, and her father died from burns all over his body. But she is of a different class and in a different social position than the women she photographs. And also the varying positions in relation to the gaze and the camera that each of them occupies. The problem of techne, or technology, of a kind of mastery of the camera and understanding of its workings, comes to interlace with the problem of object-subject relations in realist photography, and also in relation to what gets seen as dirty or troubling or out of place. So that's my moment to reference two different layers of the Troubling Images title of this talk series: what the images trouble, and also the troubling matters that they are disclosing. Tokiwa's own history confirms that just as gender is something that one does rather than something one is, or the being of gender is created through a less than stable process of doing, similarly, realism is something one does in relation with the world, technology, the gaze, and others. In the first section of Kiken na Arabana, titled Cameraman in a Skirt, she begins with a quote from an unknown other questioner. "Since you're not a man but a woman, does this give you some kind of advantage in taking photographs?" She tells us, "I often receive this question." And from the very first line of the book, Tokiwa is interpolated by some kind of questioner as a woman. And I think that it's really interesting the way that what she winds up doing is making the questioner come at her. So she doesn't start out assuming what it means to be a woman, but it starts out as an attribution of gender. And then she responds to it by saying that she doesn't really believe in a difference between, or a distinction between, male and female work or art. But she nonetheless says that the person is not mistaken either. So it's kind of this push me, pull you around the question of what it means. And a bit later, she writes this slightly cryptic line, because it's between women, someone's voice is heard, a voice is heard. So again, she attributes a kind of projection from an anonymous questioner who's trying to understand what between women means. And the obvious thing here is that she means because she's a woman and she's photographing women in the red light district. But she says, just because it's between or among women, one must not overlook the fact that from those women's point of view, there would be lurking in the background an instinctive feeling of antipathy, an animosity that causes them to be vigilant, that warns them against or causes them to keep a sharp lookout toward a person from another world. And this is reproduced on the obi of the book as well, the kind of advertising belt on the outside of the book. So on the surface, Tokiwa is just telling us that because of the other world that she comes from, well-dressed, higher socioeconomic class, from elsewhere, she doesn't immediately fit in the world of the red light district. Also because she's an unknown person, and that might be as far as we take it. But she's also telling us that we can't assume affinity or empathy because of both being women. The category itself does not fully hold. And further, if the dangerous poison flowers that one assumes to be the sex workers in the red light district are imagined as the locus of danger, and our job as viewers of photography is to gaze on them voyeuristically or empathetically, as is our preference, here she immediately foregrounds how in that world it is she, as a woman wielding the camera, who might represent actual danger, the one to be vigilant against and not they. And further, that the ones doing the looking from their point of view are they. So it's like kanojo tachi kara mireba, they're the ones looking. That they are the kanojo tachi, the collective before her that is doing the looking, and she becomes the alien. Yet if that moment might seem to trouble the balance of power of the gazes in this interaction, still, very often, Tokiwa uses metaphors of hunting for her act of photography. She says things like, my eyes caught sight of the prey. She's at a festival scene. Let's see if I have that. At a festival scene and holding her camera inside her jacket. You can see there's a parade going on and she's pretending to be shooting the parade, but actually the monk is blurred and what she's shooting is the woman behind. She says, watashi no me wa emoto toraeta. My eyes catch or capture or pounce or bag the spoils, the trophy, the prey. Her eyes do some seizing and make her ready to take pictures of an objectified object. However, in the very next sentence, from a dim peep window, a woman looking steadily this way. She has very sharp, piercing eyes. Nanimono mo iotoshiso na ganko da. Nanimono mo iotoshiso na ganko da. She has like a piercing light in her eyes, a glitter that looks like it's going to shoot down everything, kind of like a hail of arrows. In what follows, she describes how she raises the camera to her eye and shoots the photo, probably this one, which also appears on the back cover of the book, and then notices that a male lover has seen through the window what she's doing. What follows is that he chases her down the street and she runs like mad, losing her clogs in the process, her geta. This scene shows a complexity in the subject-object relation. First of all, Tokiwa, though a woman photographer, is posing herself as doing a masculinized version of shooting her prey, seizing her prize, transitioning as she enters the optical space of the photographic drama, for this is not without its dramatic production value, transgendering herself in a sense. And then she's not the only one shooting with her gaze, for the eyes or glance of the woman who sees her ultimately also takes on the role of shooting down everything. What she does here is emphasize the reversal of the gaze by the object of the photo, and also the not at all steady, quite complicated gendering of the technologically mediated capture that draws out the the topics of escape, pursuit, surveillance, such that in the end she winds up as much the prey as the hunter, though she gets away. While the ethics of her photos are very much in keeping with the snap culture of the time, taking unwitting subjects, usually in public space, gradually she narrates how she comes to feel empathy with them, increasingly relating to them and connecting to them until the problematic ethics of the project, at least for a moment, shifts from within. The combination, so in terms of my methodology, taking these moments from the text and the complex images together, they put stress on the essentialist readings, both of gender and of realism. On page 23 of the book, here's the translation of that little quote. She writes, because it's between women, someone's voice is heard. So that was the quote we just talked about. That goes in the middle here of this image, where on the left, a woman is drinking a ramune sweet drink. As Tokiwa writes, they often did after their baths, and eventually they stopped paying attention to her. This woman holding a cigarette, if I'm reading it right, is perhaps passing an annoyed glance in the direction of our photographer. And on the right, a woman looks in the mirror, her obi or kimono belt not yet tied. And Tokiwa described how the women preparing for their night tied each other's obi in front of the big mirror. Yet we don't see her reflection. Instead, we see the framing or staging of this space half obscured in the white space of the book itself, as if there might even be a between women, an onnadoshi, of a woman with her own reflected self, herself before and after costuming, the after and before of her labor and leisure. The imagined collectivity is fragmented by a multiplicity of selves in and out of focus, refracting upon one another through various technologies of the gaze, the mirror, and the camera lens. So as her writings go on, she talks about different moments and different ways that there could be a relation between the photographer and subjects, including a moment in which she takes a picture of relating an early moment, a first moment of photography in which she's taking a picture of a ballet performance. And she says she needs, this is very resonant with the kinds of things that Domon also talked about, that she needs to onore o muta suru, like make myself into nothing. But then she has to breathe with the performer, and then pop, she takes the picture. So that idea of a corporeal alignment or attunement with the object, but also the nullification or emptying of the self. Another moment she talks about is a kind of moment where all the women are talking about the technology of photography, and these women are saying there's no way that she's gonna, a woman is, or a woman cameraman is gonna, or she is gonna be able to take a photo in this dark space. It won't be able to be captured. So there's a moment where everyone is kind of participating in this, and she winds up tricking them, telling them that she's interested in the light on the bottles that are behind the women playing cards. And so part of what's interesting about that to me is the way that they almost do have a sense that the camera's gaze will miss the real, that it will need supplementation by the caption and the story to have its effect. Or maybe they know that Tokiwa will be capturing herself as much as them, and that their gaze is on her as hers is on them. And when one of the women expresses envy for her job as a cameraman, it in some ways places them all on the same continuum as working women, which ultimately winds up making them part of this circuit of women earning by their embodied labor. That is a topic she had pursued in her early photography of pro wrestlers, nude models, geisha, nurses, department store workers, and sea divers. In Euro-American photography, some might argue that Japanese realism is the equivalent of what Stieglitz called straight photography. Yet if so, then to twist his terms a bit, what Tokiwa is doing is a little more queer, a little less straight. The relations among the women and refractions and roles within the women are complex. This kiss photo she presents as one of her personal favorites from her early work. People, foreigners saying goodbye at the port of Yokohama, though we know they're just probably giving each other a kiss on the cheek. It looks a little more serious. Or in some of her work, women at New Year's, showing this profound intimacy as they wander along the streets, reading a book of lyrics. Tokiwa is hiding behind a temporary New Year's clothing sale rack as she takes this. For all the moments in which Tokiwa takes on the relatively exploitative secret photographer, hunter, grabber of great shots position, there are many moments where she hesitates and becomes divided against herself in these narratives. Spurred on by thoughts that I was seeing something I should not be seeing, I took my eyes away from the lens, she writes. Or I felt a strange cold and I stopped my hand on the shutter and just stared at the woman's figure. I thought of developing and printing the figures. At last you've got something, said the second woman within myself. That's right, at last, but the last picture was a little too much. While closing the tripod, I murmured, resisting the second person within myself. So she stages out this conflict between oneself and another, the one that wants to take the photos and see, and the one that thinks it's too much, that wants to photograph, and the one that wants to close the camera, stop the shutter, and look away. This plays out even more strongly even later in the book, and where she notices the women that she is photographing don't seem to care anymore, and they're so fully depleted or empty that they can't resist her camera. She finds that those moments are the most disturbing. In the health clinic, where the women are obliged to come to get checked for STDs so they can continue to work, she takes on the left here the distant perspective. On the right, she's really aligned with the perspective of the doctor. But in the next shot, in the caption, in this caption related to the next shot, she writes, she lay for a long time prone, face down, in her right hand, between her fingers, the cigarette she was in the middle of smoking, letting up purple smoke. How weary, how listless seeming, a person who is completely exhausted from living. That was the feeling that left a strong impression on me. Taking it a step further, in a moment of which we don't have a photograph at all, in fact, she stops taking photos. There's a young woman in a clinic stricken by a certain bacteria, probably related to syphilis, which caused her to have neurological symptoms. The woman is unaware of her surroundings, detached from precisely the reality that realism is so enamored with. The doctor in the clinic, in a shared intention with Tokiwa, is aiming to make a social critique of the phenomenon of prostitution. So she allows Tokiwa to photograph there. There's a moment Tokiwa describes when she faces the woman, and when the woman notices her looking, she begins to put on makeup, to go through the gestures of putting on makeup, though she has no makeup there in the clinic. I quietly took out the camera, which was concealed beneath the white coat, without noticing the now completely exposed camera. She has no thought for anything but the fictitious makeup. Already the adjustments of the iris, the shutter, and the exposure on the camera have been completed. So if I peek in the viewfinder and press the shutter, the moment will suddenly change hyohen suru into something decisive, kette tekina mono, that decisive moment, that instant or juncture was already in my hands. Seeing the woman before her, Tokiwa was intending to carry on her practice of snap photography with the concealed camera, but in the end, she actually pulls the camera out of its place, exposing the camera itself. She's describing and exposing herself as a photographer as well. She's describing this search for that well-known decisive moment, that kettei-teki na mono, the decisive thing that is absolute. But at the same time, she shows how that moment is made decisive by the action of the shutter. She has it in the palm of her hand. So it's a kind of strange temporality that it's already there, but it's also in some way about to become something. However, the woman before me, whom I was aiming at, did not react at all. She didn't show any change in her aspect. Not so much that she was absent-minded, but it was as if she were so taken by the image of her own face reflected in the imaginary mirror that she had no thought but of the gestures of putting on the makeup. A deer drinking water from a mountain stream without noticing the muzzle of a gun being pointed at her. I was caught by such a thought. Both of them are caught. The woman is caught, taken by her own looking. She's looking, enraptured by her own image in the mirror, in the imaginary mirror. She's in some sense trapped, mesmerized by that, but also by the strange movements of her mind, more locally by the act of looking at her own face and by the fictional world she's imagined, but then also in a way caught by extension by the whole situation she finds herself in within the red light district. Tokiwa is also caught, stopped by the thought, though it's strange because she so often used these gun metaphors. Here she's catching the photo in secret. She usually talks about catching the photo in secret being like a kind of exciting, dangerous game. But in this case, the absence of reaction, the absence of resistance, a bit like that woman on all fours with a cigarette who's so exhausted of life, allows the rhetoric of the decisive moment to meet the rhetoric of violent acts and stop her in her tracks. What kind of optic allows Tokiwa to see herself in this instant? We follow a complex play of gazes and mirrors, of fictionality and factuality, of imagination and realisms that resonate across the two and break the realism gender technological optics chain. And so there's also this kind of strange kind of shooting back coming from the woman herself. Even if I pressed the shutter hundreds of times, as many times as I wanted, she would be no different from a stone by the roadside, robo no ishi. The freedom to release the shutter was completely in my hands. I was absolutely unable to bring the camera to position. Something that shot out, that fired or launched or emitted from her meaningless gestures did not permit me to do so. So I'm interested in the way, in some metaphorical sense, the shot fires both ways. Something's not in sync between them, not in common between them. There's an absolutely decisive distinction, a zure, as you would call it in Japanese, or a dislocatedness. The expected script of shooting and of the subject, even the expected script of the subject resisting being photographed, central to the performative act of realist photography here in this staging has, in a sense, broken or snapped, and it doesn't work. A moment later, Tokiwa seems to try to recuperate that impossible distance by re-invoking a commonality of gender. What made me decide to bury this one-time chance forever? Perhaps it was because the waves of emotions, the ups and downs, the undulations of feeling that only a woman can possess, feelings of a woman who cannot resist, covered over the second me, who is the cameraman within myself. So for a moment, she returns to a more kind of essentialist view of woman and of feminine commonality, woman as necessarily passive, unable to resist or struggle, woman who can feel things that men can't feel, waves of feeling that come out of being in a less powerful position. And it is this that perhaps Domon would have said was the goal of realist photography, the awakening of a political consciousness of solidarity, a deeper feeling of connection and empathy with the subject that leads to a socio-political awareness of the struggles of the lower classes. And I'm at time, so I'll just finish up here as I'm watching the sunset. And actually, that's what Tokiwa herself would have also said. that she's moving toward empathy. It wouldn't be in error to tell the story in that way. But rather than stopping at that essentialist tautology, I would like to instead say that it's probably more productive to hold on to this strange self-division that Tokiwa embodies, this cameraman within herself, and how it's that second being that gets covered over or cloaked or masked in the same way that she had previously covered over her camera inside her furoshiki, showing how this self is composed of multiple pieces and their gendering does not always remain stable. Rather, the optical process, the interaction with the technological, as well as scientific and medical diagnosis, runs up against the shifts of imagination of everyone in the room. And so I think, and it's not just human gender, it's also stones, deer, all of these things are imbricated. So she goes on after this to become very interested in photographing this figure of Oroku. A little bit later, she begins by meeting her in the Bon Odori and describing her emotionless expression. And I can talk more about this in the Q&A. Eventually, she enters the room of Oroku and this intimate space, continuing this kind of performative, hyper-performative stylization of the labor of femininity, dramatized. And there are a whole series of wonderful photographs of Oroku that I hope to go into in the further continuation of this process. Just to sum it up, her work suggests that we would do best to resist essentializing the meaning or connotation of the word woman, as her work leaves behind complex traces of how gender is made, how realism is made, via and in relation to the optical technologies of their moment. The first flex, the primo flex, held in the hand, the dual reflex lens constructing reflections on the instincts, dangers, and complexities of exploitation, of exoticisms of gender, revealing to us the local, layered, and complex multiplicity of the real. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Miryam. That is an incredibly rich talk, and I really appreciate your close reading of talking about writing. This phrase that sticks with me in particular is this idea of the shot firing both ways, as you put it. And I've also been very interested in some of my own recent work about this idea of the photographic act and looking at photography in terms of photographing and the impact that it has on the photographer. And being able to see that through the writing that's being done, that Tokiwa was kind of talking through these different subject positions. Is that something that you have found, I wonder, in other photographers that may be part of this ongoing project? I know you've read a lot around Provoke, and you mentioned Nakahira Takuma, for example, and of course there's a lot of interesting writing in his work around that type of experience of the photographic act. Is this something that you're finding in the work of other women photographers that you could talk to?
Yeah, I very much am. Some of the further research that I want to go into involves some more little-known women photographers, such as Sasaki Michiko, who photographed the protests in Nichidai, Nihon University in the late 60s, and her kind of process of imbricating herself and connecting with the protesters. But I guess the thing for these 1950s examples that really catches me is that so many people later acted like realist photography was kind of a ground zero of taken for granted direct unmediatedness. And I thought when I read that, and then I read about the movement, the amateur photography movement of the moment, and how people were running around with their cameras, taking the unhoused people who were lying on the streets, that it had to be more complicated than that. And so that's kind of what led me back into this terrain of actually wanting to look at the realist photographers more in detail. But yeah, I'm also interested in Nishimura Tamiko, who's also kind of forgotten from around the era of Provoke, although she's now being rediscovered quite a bit thanks to Zen Photo Gallery reprinting her 1970s book of photographs of traveling around Japan. So I'm kind of just coming upon these different women photographers who, like in Nishimura's case, her travels around Japan and her act of photographing are mixed up with her memories of popular culture, like films of the time and songs of the time. So it's this very kind of augmented reality, we would say today, where like the landscape before her eyes, the act of photographing, and the previous layers or the contemporary layers of film and song wind up in this interesting relationship. So I haven't looked into it very far, but there's just a lot of people that intrigue me for that reason.
Thank you. We've got some questions coming up in the Q&A, so I'm just going to go straight into there. We have a question from Kelly Midori McCormack, who points also to, she says as a junior scholar, she'd like to also point to her article on Tokiwa Toyoko that you might be familiar with, but I'll share that in the chat from 2020, Tokiwa Toyoko and the Gendered Politics of Post-War Photography Culture. And
yes, I definitely do want to talk about that. And I think Kelly McCormack is doing some of the really pioneering work on Tokiwa. And although I found out about Tokiwa first and then found out about her essay afterwards, I really appreciated the analysis of the structure of nude photography in that essay. And I also am appreciating Kelly's work in, maybe you can put it in the chat, Kelly, about the online resource that you're creating with teaching units about women photographers, because I think that's going to be a really, it is already contains a wonderful wealth of videos of experts on Japanese photography talking about women photographers.
That would be great to see. I'll get to the question here, which is just your thoughts on the ethics of representing photographs of women representing photographs of women whose photographs were taken without their consent. How might we reframe her work in a way where it's not always introduced in reference to well-known male photographers who were her contemporaries, or does so in a productive way?
Yeah, I think that those are both good questions. There's one question of, if I'm showing photos that are ethically, this is Kelly's question, or is that a different person? That process of re-showing them, like I'm entering into a layered process that's already layered. So I think it's absolutely true, that creates complexities. And I think that what I try to do in my own work is slow down enough to see and at least be aware of what's going on in the process, rather than just trying to show them in a sensationalist way, which is, I think, sometimes how they're shown, the violence that they depict, that I want to kind of take us a little slower and a little lower into the kind of refractions and reflections of gazes that are happening there. But I would say that there's definitely there's a complexity in that process of showing them again in order to talk about them. But I still also feel that it's very valuable for us to slow down and take time to look at photographers who haven't really been taken seriously as photographers, but more as, taken as a kind of document of reality or something like that. And in terms of bringing in Domon, I guess I understood that in this series, it was important to kind of frame the version of realism against which so many 60s and 70s photographers were pushing, the thing that and there's the middle range of also the vivo photographers using kind of the idea of the subjective that intervenes in between those. So yeah.
It's interesting for me that I'm looking at Taiwan in a similar sort of period, and this idea of photographs being first collected as historical documents and only more recently being considered as part of sort of artistic or photographic practice for different and yet somehow resonant reasons. It's a similar kind of issue where people are now looking back and thinking about this kind of process behind the camera as well.
Yeah, and it becomes really quite difficult, you know, when they're not sort of seen as important commodities, then there's actually a lot of complexity in attempting to study them. There's a lot of disagreements in the documentation around when were certain photographs taken, who took them in the case of some of the other photographers that I was looking at, and even like what year, were they born, things like that. So I don't know.
Thank you. I've just following up. Thank you, Kelly, for putting the link in the Q&A. I'm leaving it in the chat as well for the Behind the Camera Japan. I have two more questions here, which I hope we have time to get to. And one is around technology and the other is about culture. And so there's a question here saying, you know, thank you for a wonderfully rich discussion, and mentioning this idea of something shooting out from the subject, preventing the photographer from shooting. They say photographers know this well, at least I think women photographers, and this is coming from someone who I know has a long photographic practice and research practice. You speak of the technological gaze. Can you say a little of the technological context in which Tokiwa is working? So it's a period of expansion of camera production in Japan, which changes us everywhere. So the shift from German dominance, for example, of optical industries to sort of Japanese industry as well. How does this impact on Tokiwa? You mentioned her subjects commenting, for example, on low light. There's a widespread awareness of how light works in photography. So is this something that from other writing or from her work you can comment on, the sort of technological aspect?
Yeah, she talks about the use of the first flex and then the primo flex, and then moving to the Canon. So in some ways, her work is enabled by that that widespread availability of the handheld camera, and that's also part of what the realist movement, you know, the realist movement grows out of that, because those magazines were made in part to kind of be a stimulus and a teaching tool for regular street photographer, regular people to go out there and start to take these photos and to be able to develop them, to have enough wealth little by little to be able to afford to develop them. So she's very much in that stream, and also, you know, forms the Shirayuri Camera Club, a kind of group of amateur women photographers. So she starts to kind of herself participate. She's in the Hama group, which is kind of tutored by some of those male photographers that Kelly would like us to stop talking about, and then she founds these clubs, and then she's also involved in other associations of women photographers. So I guess in terms of the technology, I'm not sure what I can say about the shooting back thing. I think that you're right in many ways, that is something that the photographer would know, that the photographer would feel. And I think that's where the snap or the break comes, is that actually not feeling that shot back, not feeling the look coming back from those exhausted women, is actually kind of messes up her photographic process in a way, or at least that's how she narrates it. And of course, I'm relying on her own description here to get these metaphors. But so it's interesting and resonant that someone with a photographic practice, aware of those technological changes, would talk about the ways that impacts photographers and women photographers to this day. How that has developed. Of course, now we all have phones and are taking photos all the time. I guess I see myself getting very dark. You see the sunset in Berkeley.
It's getting a bit darker there. Hopefully we can take one more.
Speaking of light, right?
Yes. So there's a couple more questions in the Q&A that I will keep to the side and hopefully get to later. One around the issue of danger potentially on the street as a woman photographer. The other pointing to Okamura Taiko, so Tokiwa Toyoko's husband, who was also photographing in the same area, whether there's a relationship between their work. But I'll take the question on culture, because you've spoken a little bit, of course, you've spoken around gender and around class to some extent, and her sort of consciousness of that. The question here, just briefly, is whether there's a specific cultural aspect to ideas of womanhood, femininity, particularly in Tokiwa's reading of it. Do you believe that Japanese culture at the time, and perhaps continually, additionally, the way in which non-white bodies experience the world has an impact on these things? So other sorts of aspects of, or perspectives on this work. Is that something?
Yeah, that's a lot of really good stuff. I mean, I would be very hesitant to say, oh, Japanese photographers do this, but clearly, there is a situation of women in post-war Japan that is specific, and the non-white body on the, in the space of the GI dominated areas of Yokosuka, where the relation between the, the Americans, Black and white Americans, and the Japanese are very fraught with racial questions that many photographers have followed up in really interesting ways, and many filmmakers as well. So I think that that's a really good question to highlight and foreground in this instance. And I think in the photographs of Oroku, when I showed that Bon Odori shot, one of the first things my students noticed was the little white guy in the back, like a child in a yukata, who's Caucasian, and the sense of him also being kind of dragged into this situation of himself kind of being in drag as a Japanese person, brought into this Bon Odori, and the kind of strange contrast between him and how Tokiwa depicts that, and Oroku's, very strong, expressionless, powerful image in the front of the photo. So I think those are very good questions, and there's a lot to say about them, also about Tokiwa's role in relation to her husband, Okamura Taiko. I think that is one of the ways in which her work has been received, is in a joint exhibition of the two of their work together in that area. And it would be an interesting work to follow up, to think more about the differences and similarities, but certainly his work is very important to her, and is very much within a certain discourse of that period and those acts of photographing at the time.
Well, thank you very much for taking us through those last questions. I know that we're up for time, but there's much more to unpack here. It's great that we've been able to share more work around Tokiwa as well. So thank you to Kelly for pointing us in that direction. There are, for those of you who are still watching the chat, there are a couple of other sort of links that Nick, my colleague at Power, has put in there for you to follow up. Otherwise, there was a question around recording that I think Nick responded to. This is being recorded. It will be shortly available online. So if you know somebody who missed it and would like to point them in that direction, you'll be able to do so as well. Otherwise, thank you so much, as the light is literally sort of drawing to a close. Thank you so much again for your talk today, for joining us and being able to wrap up such a rich series this year with your new research, Professor Sas.
I'm so grateful to be invited and to have this opportunity to begin a kind of the sprout of the next thing. So it's been wonderful to work with you and get to know you. I'm very honored to be part of it.
Thank you. And thanks all for joining. Take care.